Good morning. Good morning. Again, thank you for your hospitality. Pesach, Passover in the early 1970s. I don't remember which year, but I'm sure there's historians amongst you who can say, I'm almost sure it was the first Earth Day. And being a fledgling environmentalist, Boy Scout, vegetarian, loving nature, I felt I had to do something. And it fell on the last day of Passover. Now you may know in traditional Judaism that many people on the Sabbath and the first and the last day of Tabernacles and Passover don't drive in a car, don't ride in a car, don't watch TV, don't use phones, don't use electricity, at least not actively. And so I decided, and I must have been 12, I decided I was not going to ride in a car to synagogue that morning. Had a little bit of an argument with my father. My mother, who's here this morning, she can tell you whether that's true or just in my mind. And I rode my bike the 4 miles from my parents' house to the synagogue, which was a big deal when you're 12. A few months passed by, and I'm in summer camp, conservative movement summer camp in Ojai, California, that I'd gone to every summer. And we had a counselor who was a rabbinical student from New York who was also, I remember, Republican. And I couldn't get that through my mind. Because all the Jews that I had met were Democrats. And so we split into discussion groups about the weekly portion. And he mentioned something about Jewish identity and doing things for the right reasons. I don't remember exactly what I said. And at some point, he's talking to a group of about 15, 20 of us. He says, I'll give you an example. I was in a synagogue in North Hollywood over Passover, and the rabbi announced that this young man, this boy in the synagogue, had ridden his bicycle on Earth Day and was so proud that he had a young member of his congregation that took his conscience to his deeds as well. And here's this counselor in camp months later saying, I thought that was the stupidest thing I ever heard. Had the rabbi said, this young man has taken upon himself not to ride in a car on the Sabbath and on the holiday, that would be an accomplishment. But to be part of this? I did tell some of my friends he's talking about me. None of them believed me. So Earth Day carries a memory. And combining with scripture of today from the Hebrew Bible, I would say as a rabbi and also as a teacher of Bible over decades, the question I have received the most, the absolute most common question I've had on biblical text is, how does the text say that God says, let us create humanity in our image? Who's us? Or as the joke went, who's we, Kimosabi? Right? Who's the us there? And there's lots of understandings, lots of commentaries throughout the generations. The one that's most common to most Jews who grew up reading Torah with Rashi's commentary is that God asked the angels. God consulted with the angels. Not, God forbid, because God needed the angels to agree, but as a good manager, God wanted to give the angels a feeling that they're part of the decision-making process. God looks around to God's accompanying angels and says, what do you think? Is it now time to create humanity? Another medieval commentary found in at least 2 of the rabbinical commentaries in Europe is that we, in this sense, is the royal we. Perhaps some of you heard that before. And that makes sense when you come from a language, an area where there's languages, European languages, that have a royal we. But there's no royal we in Semitic languages. So that's been shot down in the last century, more or less. And there are those that said, well, this reflects the earlier strata of biblical liturgy, biblical theology. when God is not really alone yet. As it says in some scriptural passages, El Elyon, the highest of gods. Or on the Song of the Sea, Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai, Mi chamocha nedar b'kodesh. Who is like you, God, amongst all the other gods? What is that about? And theologians of the 20th century, late 19th, 20th century, taught us that it didn't happen overnight, this revolution of one God. There were other gods that became demigods, that slowly became angels, and then in a pure monotheism just drifted away entirely. So all of those answers are not entirely satisfying. There is an answer, a grammatical answer that probably is what I would say today the real answer. The real meaning, going back to the original meaning of the text, is if we could do so, and that is it's in order to emphasize. It's something the Bible does from time to time when somebody speaks about themselves in the plural because they're about to do something really important. Perhaps that's it. But my favorite commentary, my favorite interpretation on this, I think it began around the late 70s in Jewish circles. But I haven't pinpointed the person who first said it. So I'd like to say a lot of us rabbis and clergy of progressive mind and spirit, especially when it comes to the environment, have been saying this and preaching this, is that after each of those days where God speaks and the thing becomes, and then towards the end where God gets the land, the earth, to be part of the creation process, like the beginning of our reading today with the animals. God commandeers God's creation to help God continue to create. And so then God says, so what do you think, guys? Should we make this humanity thing? Should we do it? And God is talking to the camels and the elephants and the slithering things and the worms and the mosquitoes and the ants and the sand and the mud and the granite and the trees. God is talking to all of creation saying, what do you think, guys? Should we do this humanity thing? If only the story was told that way all these years. If only we, at the very first chapter, especially Jews who read this stuff every year over and over again, one chapter after another, if only we had been taught that we weren't for sure. That no, the creation was not just for us, as we were taught. It's the pinnacle of this drawn-out process of 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. And finally, no. Maybe creation could have said, why ruin a good thing? We got the flowers, the bee, we got everything feeding into each other. And perhaps that's what Jesus is referring to in the gospel. This idyllic situation that everything would work had we not come and screwed it up. Humanity. If only we had learned this lesson of humility here. In the Talmudic tradition, there's always a discussion, an argument. That's who we are. It's in our DNA. Every item of Jewish practice is argued. And the beauty of the Talmud, Babylonian Talmud, is that nothing is settled. It's left up in the air. And so common customs, local customs took hold. But there's an argument between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua. Rabbi Eliezer says the world was created in Tishrei, in the fall month, when Rosh Hashanah occurs. And indeed, in the liturgy of the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, we sing Hayom Harat Olam. This was the day that the earth was born. And it's a celebration of the beginning of the world, hence the beginning. And that's interesting, and that's nice, but from a historical point of view, the real New Year in the Bible should be in the spring. When you look at the text, it's only under the influence of Babylonian culture did the Jewish people move towards the New Year of the Babylonians and then incorporate it into Judaism, or I should say appropriated. Rev Kev and I are often talking about appropriation when it's proper, not when it's appropriate or not. And my view is that everybody gets to do everything. And I think that comes from Talmudic lore. And back to this argument. So Rabbi Eliezer says it was in Tishrei, it was in the fall. And Rabbi Yeshua says, no, it was in Nisan. It was in the springtime. And they go back and forth and bringing passages from different parts of Scripture to prove their point, as often happens in the Talmudic discussion. But there's one place, not in the Babylonian Talmud, but in an obscure place that says, you know what it's like? It's like Rabbi Eliezer says, according to Rabbi Eliezer, that when Adam and Eve were created, they were sat down at a table that was filled with everything. The table was set, the food was there, all was prepared. In the land of Israel, that's the end of the summer. The fall is where the storehouses are full, the grain, the wine, the oil, everything's there. And so first humanity sat down to a table which was already made up. According to Rabbi Yeshua, it's no. God said, I need these folks to grow up with creation. In the beginning of the harvest season, that's when they're going to be created, so they can go painfully, they can go through life understanding that little by little the earth produces what it produces. Not to have it ready-made, but to work with. And if only, I say to myself, if only that had been the predominant message of Judaism and of Christianity and of Islam and of every tradition that has these kinds of creation stories. Because had it been the dominant factor, then perhaps people would have translated the word as is translated in the translation here, stewardship and not ownership. Because the Hebrew could very easily be understood as owned, as mastered. Stewardship is a modern translation, one that I agree with, one that's crucial and important. But had we understood stewardship, that we've grown up together and then laid the table together with the rest of nature, had we heard that voice before we were born, before we created, saying, maybe not, and understood that we are not on top of everything, then perhaps our theology would be, or would have been, more supportive of a different approach to the environment and how we as humanity have taken the world as a given, for granted. I often share with you how much I've learned from the Christian tradition, which is only appropriate. We're here to interchange, to grow from each other. And I did leave out one commentary, which is the most prevalent commentary in the Christian tradition, the older Christian tradition at least, and that God is consulting with the other two parts of the Trinity. So what does that have to teach a rabbi, a committed rabbi, to normative Judaism? And that God has different parts as well. And in the same way that God needs to ask God's self, the other parts of God's self, in order to be sure this is the right decision, so do we have to always be asking ourselves, the different parts of humanity, the individual males and females that were created in this story. This is not about Adam and Eve. This is about individuals that were created. And how they, on their first Shabbat, when they saw that God rested, and they said, well, perhaps we should rest as well, not one person decided what would be rest. Not one person decided what would be worship of God. Not one person decided for the rest. Everyone was consulted. Thank you.
Amen.